All right, cool. So I'm going to close this guy, and we're going to go into web scraping. So what is web scraping? So web scraping basically is, ideally we just want data that's formatted for us, but it's not always the cleanest stuff. And that's really when you hear like this scraping or munging and stuff like this, it's like, it's something like a real pain to get all this data from here. And really, I almost imagine it like when you say scrape, like web scraping, it's like scraping this, like the stuff off of a plate. It's like, you got to kind of dig in there and like really get like the right thing out and kind of scrape it off that's crusted too much. That's how I'm imagining web scraping. So in general, and this is like not a strict thing, but this is how I kind of view stuff, is the order of preference of data. Usually you want direct access to formatted data. So like a database, a CSV. In fact, I almost say a lot of CSVs are like nicely formatted, as long as they're from some data, centric place. So I'm like, oh, good, I get a CSV. It's already basically mostly neat. Maybe it's a database, like a SQL database. I can pull that out. Awesome. Next option is API. I would say depending on what kind of API is, I might even put API higher up, but API does rely on the fact that someone else has to give you this information. So API call to get this data. It's formatted in a way that I'm expecting. I know how to go through. The next part is scraping this data. So scraping the data, it just takes effort. You're just going to have to basically know what the structure is and basically try to find the data in there. Okay, like, so you're trying to like dig for gold essentially. Well, I shouldn't say dig for gold. That's, you usually know a little bit better. It's more like, I don't know, drilling for oil. People know where oil is, something like that, right? People have an idea. They're not just like drilling randomly in places and saying, oh, is there oil? They kind of have a general idea of what the structure is going to look like. I guess that's kind of it. And then other sources, I just threw in there because like, I don't know. You can have things like maybe you collect the data yourself, which is like the most awful thing for a data scientist because you don't want to do that. You want data now. You don't want to wait for the data. So think of like, sending out your own surveys and stuff like this. And ideally you want to have it some of these sources. Okay, so web scraping is, I like to say, bottom of the barrel. You're scraping this part. Okay, but it can be really useful because sometimes the data just doesn't exist. All right, so that's my really quick intro to web scraping. So one quick note I added in the Center for Web Scraping Ethics is web scraping is kind of in this gray area sometimes. There actually was a recent court case that ruled in favor of web scraping, but I will say be aware of this. Like, is that sometimes people might kind of go, I don't know how to say this, like they won't go after you necessarily, but like if the data is a little more like private and you really shouldn't look for that data, maybe kind of take a second and say, hey, is this legal? Like, is this something I should be doing? Like, and even if it's not, even if it is legal, you're like, is this ethically okay? For example, if you find a bunch of like medical records that are just exposed and you can scrape all of it, can you do it? Maybe, but like, maybe you don't want to do that because that's maybe not the best thing you should do. I will tell you that a lot of websites, and you'd be surprised that a lot of enterprise places don't properly protect their stuff and you can scrape them really easily. This is where I will say the gray area, talk to your lawyer kind of deal. But in general, web scraping has kind of been favored in the sense that if you can publicly access it, and usually publicly access means if you can, go to the website like you just saw right here on like Android Police and access it, it's kind of fair game for you to scrape it. What you do with that data is different, obviously, like for copyright reasons, but scraping itself isn't necessarily like an illegal thing or anything like that. But I just wanted to add that in there because just always be aware. And also, I think as data scientists, should always be aware of what the ethics are too. Okay.